Jenna, thanks. In our continuing coverage of President Donald Trump's first week of his second term in office, backlash continues to unfold after the president signed an executive order cutting birthright citizenship. And with thousands of undocumented immigrants expected to be impacted by this, including school students, state officials here in Massachusetts are expressing their outrage and their will to fight back. Western Mass News reporter Matt Price live in studio with more. Matt, what details can you share?
Chris, we know several lawmakers and officials across the country have shown their disdain and disapproval of this move by President Trump as he looks to get his crackdown on immigration underway. The executive order Trump signed on Monday, cutting birthright citizenship for so many people who were born in the United States and are descendants of those who came into this country without documentation. There has especially been talk about ICE agents possibly going to school districts, including those in sanctuary cities, to find undocumented students. 3 of those cities here in Western Mass: Springfield, Northampton, and Amherst. Now, on Tuesday, we learned Massachusetts became one of nearly 24 states that are suing the Trump administration for this policy, saying it violates the Constitution. A number of officials in the Commonwealth have expressed backlash coming from the top. Among them, Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Joy Campbell. She posted on X, formerly known as Twitter, Tuesday afternoon, saying, quote, "President Trump thinks he can ignore the Constitution and deny birthright citizenship from thousands of innocent children. It's a cruel, egregious overstep of his authority. We're suing to stop this unlawful plan in its tracks." That post was retweeted by Governor Maura Healey, who added the following: "The Constitution is clear. Every child born within our borders deserves the same rights and freedoms as anyone else. I support this action by AG Campbell. Massachusetts will continue to do everything we can to defend the principles America was founded on." As we mentioned earlier this evening, Western Mass News heard from superintendents from both Northampton Public Schools and Hadley Public Schools, both of them bringing up how the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, also known as FERPA, cannot share student information. Of course, this comes amidst the possible threat of ICE agents coming to the districts. Stick with us both on air and online as we follow the latest developments related to this executive action. Reporting live in the studio, Matt Price, Western Mass News.
Matt, thanks for that live report. The Trump administration